HOA Karen sent 10 wild boars to destroy my farm. Too bad I trained boars for combat in Iraq intro. You ever think your worst enemy would be the very person living down the road? Well, I sure didn't. Not until my HOA's very own self-appointed Queen Bee, Karen, decided to unleash chaos on my land. 10 massive, snarling wild boars charging straight into my farm, tearing up everything in sight. She thought she had me cornered. What she didn't know was that back in Iraq, I didn't just serve, I trained combat boars. And if Karen wanted a war, she was about to get one. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the kind of person who believed a clipboard and a loud voice gave her power over everyone around her. In our neighborhood, the HOA was supposed to be about keeping things neat and organized, making sure the lawns stayed trimmed and the houses looked tidy, but Karen twisted those rules into her own personal kingdom. She strutted around like she owned the entire community, barking orders, handing out fines, and inventing new rules on the spot if it meant making someone else's life more difficult. People learned to avoid crossing her because even the smallest disagreement could turn into a full-blown war. I'd heard the stories before I moved in, but I thought they were exaggerated. Maybe she was strict, I told myself, but surely no one could be that bad. It didn't take long for me to learn just how wrong I was. At first, Karen's interference was almost laughable. She'd stop me on the street to comment on the length of my grass or lecture me about the shade of paint I chose for the barn. She complained that my work boots left dirt on the sidewalk, and once she even claimed that the sound of my tractor violated quiet hours, even though I'd been done working well before dusk. Every interaction with her had the same smug undertone, like she was testing me, waiting for me to break and bow down to her authority. The other neighbors just shrugged and said, "That's Karen for you." But I could see the exhaustion in their eyes. She had worn them down to the point where they'd rather just stay quiet than risk her wrath. Karen thrived on control, and the HOA board meetings were her stage. I remember sitting in my first one, watching her rattle off a list of violations she claimed to have personally witnessed. Trash cans placed 6 inches too close to the curb, flower beds with unauthorized plants, and one neighbor who had dared to hang a flag she didn't approve of. She spoke with this air of superiority, as though she were some kind of general leading a troop into battle against the chaos of suburban life. Most people just nodded along, too tired or too scared to object. When someone did try to stand up to her, Karen would unleash a torrent of bylaws, page numbers, and threats of escalating fines until they backed down. It was a show she relished, and she always walked away with a smirk that said she knew she'd won. It wasn't long before I found myself in her crosshairs. Owning a farm meant long hours and hard work, and that didn't exactly fit her idea of the pristine, picture-perfect neighborhood she wanted. She'd show up at my property line, arms crossed, pointing out the dust from the fields or the odor of the livestock like she was personally offended by the reality of farm life. One day she accused me of lowering property values because my barn didn't match the color scheme she decided was best for the street. She said it loud enough for a few other neighbors to hear, making sure her disapproval was on full display. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I bit my tongue. At that point, I still believed ignoring her would be the best way to keep the peace. But Karen wasn't the kind of person you could ignore. The more I tried to mind my own business, the harder she pushed. She started sending me letters stuffed in my mailbox, full of threats about fines and mandatory corrective actions. She filed bogus complaints to the board, demanding they force me to make changes that had no basis in the actual HOA guidelines. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about her need to break me down, to make me submit. Each time she caught me outside, she'd drop some snide remark, always with that satisfied gleam in her eyes, like she was slowly winning a game only she was playing. Then came the day she crossed a line I never thought anyone in their right mind would cross. By then, she had grown frustrated that her letters and her constant nagging weren't having the effect she wanted. I wasn't folding. I wasn't caving in like the others had, and that ate at her. I could see it every time we locked eyes across the street. Her fake smile, her clenched jaw, the way she lingered just a second too long as though trying to figure out her next move. Karen wasn't just looking for control anymore. She was looking for revenge. And when Karen wanted revenge, there was no telling how far she'd go. The tension between Karen and me didn't just build overnight. It was like a storm that gathered slowly, every gust of wind pushing us closer to the inevitable clash. At first, it was petty rules she clung to like a lifeline, making sure everyone knew she was the enforcer of the HOA. She had a way of turning the simplest guideline into a weapon. A misplaced trash can become a crime against the community. A garden hose left out too long was suddenly an act of rebellion. She didn't just enforce the rules. She reinvented them whenever it suited her. If the handbook said nothing about a situation, Karen would twist a vague phrase into a brand new decree and announce it as though the neighborhood had voted unanimously in her favor. People went along with it not because they believed her, but because the alternative was facing her wrath. Every encounter with her was like stepping into a trap. I'd find her waiting near my fence when I came home from the fields, ready to point out something she considered a violation. She carried around a little notebook, scribbling notes as though she were documenting evidence for a trial. Once, she claimed the sound of my rooster crowing was disturbing the peaceful enjoyment of the neighborhood, even though no one else had ever complained. Another time, she told me the way I stacked hay bales near the barn was unsightly and suggested I should build a decorative fence to hide them. It wasn't advice. It was an order wrapped in fake politeness. When I didn't respond the way she wanted, her smile faltered, and I could see the irritation simmering beneath the surface. Neighbors whispered about her behind closed doors. At block parties, the conversations always circled back to Karen, each person sharing their own story of how she'd find them for ridiculous things. A slightly crooked mailbox, a holiday decoration taken down a day late, even a car tire that had touched the grass while parking. She had the entire community walking on eggshells. And yet, in public, people smiled and nodded when she spoke, afraid to provoke her. It was clear she thrived on that fear. She didn't want friendship or goodwill. She wanted obedience. I became her favorite target because I refused to play along. Where others would apologize or scramble to fix whatever issue she pointed out, I stood my ground. I wasn't rude, but I didn't bow my head either. That drove her crazy. She hated that her usual tactics didn't work on me. I could see it in her eyes every time she stormed away after failing to get a reaction. The more she pushed, the more she realized I wasn't like the others, and that made me dangerous to her little kingdom. If one person resisted her, what was to stop the rest of the neighborhood from following? It wasn't long before the HOA meetings turned into her battleground against me. She'd arrive with a stack of papers, each one a so-called complaint against my farm. She accused me of creating noise disturbances, reducing property values, and violating rules that didn't even exist. She presented her case like a prosecutor, her voice sharp and dripping with false concern for the community's well-being. Most of the board sat silently, clearly too intimidated to challenge her. I spoke up, calmly pointing out that her claims had no basis, but Karen wasn't after fairness. She was after humiliation. Every word out of her mouth was designed to paint me as the villain. The more she failed to break me publicly, the more personal her tactics became. I'd find anonymous notes tucked under my door, criticizing everything from the way I parked my truck to the kind of feed I used for my animals. I knew it was her handwriting. She wasn't nearly as clever as she thought. She'd linger outside my property, pretending to be on a casual walk, though her eyes never left what I was doing. It was like being under surveillance, every move watched, every action judged. Karen wasn't satisfied with just enforcing rules. She wanted me to bend, to admit defeat, to prove she had control over me like she did with everyone else. The tension between us grew so thick that even the other neighbors started to notice. Some whispered to me that they admired how I stood up to her, while others warned me to be careful because Karen had a way of making life miserable for those who crossed her. But I wasn't the kind of man to be scared off by threats or underhanded tactics. I'd been through worse than Karen in my life, and if she thought she could intimidate me into submission, she had no idea who she was dealing with. What Karen didn't realize was that every petty attack only strengthened my resolve. I wasn't going to be her next victory, her next example of what happens when you defy her. But the more I resisted, the more desperate she became, until it was clear she was planning something bigger, something that would go far beyond fines and nasty notes. She wanted to break me in a way that the entire neighborhood would notice, and she wasn't going to stop until she thought she'd won. It was late in the evening when I first realized something was wrong. The air was unusually still, the kind of silence that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. My farm was never completely quiet. There were always the sounds of crickets, the rustle of leaves, or the distant calls of animals. But that night, it was different, almost as if nature itself was holding its breath. Then I heard it. A low, guttural snort followed by the heavy thud of hooves. At first, I thought maybe one of my animals had gotten loose, but the sound was too strong, too many footsteps to be just one. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, my instincts already on edge. What I saw in the beam of that light froze me in place. 10 massive wild boars stood at the edge of my property, their eyes glowing with a mean, hungry glint. They weren't wandering by chance. Their movements were too coordinated, their timing too perfect. They came charging toward my crops with a ferocity that told me they'd been driven here, pushed into my land by someone who wanted destruction. My mind immediately went to Karen. She had been escalating her attacks for weeks, and this was exactly the kind of unhinged stunt she would pull. 10 wild boars weren't a coincidence. This was a message. She wanted to show me that she could hit me where it hurt most. My farm, my livelihood. The sight of them tearing into the fields was something I'll never forget. They ripped through fences, knocked over feed barrels, and clawed at the earth with a frenzy that only fueled my anger. I could hear the snapping of wood and the panicked cries of my animals as the chaos unfolded. I wanted to rush in and stop them, but I knew better than to charge at a pack of wild boars unprepared. They're dangerous, aggressive, and can tear through a man if he isn't careful. I stood there, my heart pounding, forcing myself to think, to remember the training I'd had years ago in Iraq. Karen had no idea who she was dealing with. Most people saw wild boars as uncontrollable beasts, but I saw something different. Back in the service, I'd spent time in regions where wild boars were more than just a nuisance. They were a tool. With the right conditioning, they could be trained for combat, taught to follow commands, and use their natural strength as an advantage. I'd seen firsthand how effective they could be, and I'd learned exactly how to control them. Standing there on my porch, watching them tear through my farm, I felt something shift. The fear faded, replaced by a steady calm. She thought she had unleashed chaos, but what she really did was hand me the perfect opportunity to show her just how badly she had underestimated me. As the boars continued their rampage, I studied them carefully, watching the way they moved, the way they responded to one another. They were well-fed, strong, and clearly agitated, probably driven onto my property with the promise of food or by someone deliberately riling them up. It had Karen's fingerprints all over it. She thought she could weaponize them against me, but she didn't know that wild boars weren't strangers to me. They were a part of my past, a chapter of my life I rarely talked about but never forgot. The destruction around me grew louder, but instead of panic, a plan began forming in my mind. I knew the techniques, the signals, the tricks that could turn their aggression into control. My neighbors might have seen 10 wild boars as the end of the line, a death sentence for my farm, but I saw 10 powerful allies if I could get through to them. Every moment that passed was proof of Karen's desperation. She had gone beyond petty fines and nasty letters. She had declared war. And as I stood there, gripping the railing of my porch, I knew that the battle she started wasn't going to end the way she imagined. The boars were tearing into my fields, but my focus wasn't on the damage anymore. It was on the fight ahead, the test Karen didn't even realize she had set for me. She thought she had found my weakness, but in reality, she had just walked me right back into the kind of battlefield where I thrived. Back in Iraq, I had learned that survival wasn't always about the biggest guns or the strongest soldiers. Sometimes it was about creativity, about using what you had in ways no one else could imagine. The wild terrain there wasn't forgiving, and we often found ourselves dealing with threats that came at us in unexpected forms. That was when I first encountered the power of boars. At first, they were just a nuisance, wild, untamed creatures that wandered into camps and destroyed supplies. But with time, I realized there was something more to them. Their intelligence, their strength, and their relentless drive made them more than just animals. They could be trained. It started as an experiment. I had grown up around farms, so I wasn't a stranger to working with animals, and when I saw the way the boars operated in groups, I knew they could be conditioned. We began feeding them on a schedule, using specific whistles and signals to guide their behavior. To the surprise of many, the boars responded. They weren't like dogs, eager to please, but they had a fierce loyalty to routine and could be motivated when handled right. Over time, they learned to respond to commands, to move in formation, and even to guard areas we needed protected. Their thick hides made them difficult to injure, and their aggression became a weapon that worked in our favor. Most of the men in my unit had doubted me at first. They laughed when I suggested we could turn wild boars into an asset. But the first time those boars stopped a group of intruders from sneaking into our camp at night, no one laughed anymore. They charged at the threat with such force that the intruders scattered before we even had to fire a shot. That night, I earned their respect, and from then on, the boars became an unlikely part of our defense strategy. They were unpredictable to outsiders, but to us they followed a system, one built on signals, conditioning, and a deep understanding of their instincts. The training wasn't easy. Boars aren't naturally inclined to trust humans, and getting them to recognize commands took patience and a steady hand. But I learned to work with their aggression instead of against it. Their stubbornness became an advantage once I found the right ways to channel it. We used food rewards, pressure whistles, and even scent markers to guide their actions. It was dangerous work, and there were a few close calls, but in time they became more reliable than some of the equipment we carried. When you've got 10 charging boars acting on your signal, there aren't many enemies willing to stand their ground. That experience stayed with me long after I left the service. Most people didn't know about it. It wasn't exactly something you brought up at dinner parties. But it had taught me that power often hides in places others overlook. So when I saw those 10 boars charging across my farm, I didn't just see destruction. I saw a challenge I'd faced before, one I knew I could meet. The way they moved told me everything I needed to know. They weren't random strays. They were organized, motivated, and released in a way that mirrored what I'd seen back in Iraq when we intentionally directed them. The sounds of them tearing into my land brought me back to nights in the desert, the adrenaline, the weight of knowing that survival meant thinking faster and acting smarter than the enemy. Karen had no idea that by sending those animals onto my property, she had stepped into a game I'd already mastered years ago. To her, they were weapons of chaos. To me, they were familiar allies waiting to be brought under control. I remembered the signals, the cadence of whistles, the body language they responded to. My mind replayed the drills, the careful timing, the way we had harnessed their aggression into precision. Standing there on my porch, the memory of my unit and the wild desert air wrapped around me like armor. Those boars weren't just beasts tearing through my farm. They were a test of everything I had once built in the most unforgiving conditions imaginable. And I wasn't about to fail it. The moment I stepped off the porch, I felt the ground vibrating beneath my boots, the thunder of hooves pounding through the soil as the boars tore into my fields. The chaos was enough to make most men freeze, but I'd been in situations like this before. I moved quickly, keeping low, my eyes scanning the group as I searched for the leader. Boars don't just run wild without some sense of order. There's always one that the others follow, one whose movements the rest mimic. Finding that leader was the key to turning this battle around. My flashlight beam cut through the dust, catching the glint of tusks as one particularly large boar held its ground longer than the rest. That was my target. I whistled sharply, a sound I hadn't used in years, and the reaction was almost immediate. The big one froze, its ears twitching, its snout lifting as if it recognized something familiar buried deep in its instincts. The others hesitated, their frenzy breaking just long enough for me to step closer. My heart raced, but my movements stayed steady, deliberate. I pulled a feed bag I kept near the barn, the scent of grain spilling into the air, mixing with the dust and sweat. Their nostrils flared, and I saw the shift, the hunger momentarily overriding their rage. But Karen had set them loose with more than just hunger driving them. I could see how riled up they were, their eyes wild, foam at the edges of their mouths. Whoever had released them had made sure they were agitated enough to cause real damage. I needed to override that frenzy with something stronger. I called out, my voice low and firm, using the same tone I'd used years ago when commanding them in Iraq. The leader shifted, snorting, and stomped the ground. The others mirrored the movement, restless but no longer charging blindly. It was working, but I couldn't stop there. I moved further into the field, careful not to make sudden moves, my whistle ready at my lips. Every time one tried to lunge, I'd cut the air with a sharp signal, redirecting their attention back to me. Slowly, the chaos began to bend into control. They weren't tame, not by any stretch, but they were listening, responding, falling into the patterns I'd drilled into animals just like them long ago. Karen had thought she was unleashing destruction, but all she had done was deliver me the very weapon I knew how to wield better than anyone. The battle around me wasn't just against the boars, it was against the destruction they'd already caused. Fences lay broken, crops crushed under their weight, feed barrels split open and scattered. My animals were panicked, bleeding and clucking in terror. I knew I couldn't save everything that night, but my priority was clear. Control the boars before they destroyed everything. Each step I took, each command I gave, pulled them further away from the frenzy and closer to obedience. I could feel the shift, the moment when fear turned into focus. The leader let out a deep grunt, and the others circled tighter around him. They weren't charging anymore, they were waiting. I took a deep breath, letting the adrenaline sharpen my senses. I'd been here before, in deserts halfway around the world, when the odds were against us and one wrong move meant disaster. Back then, I hadn't flinched, and I wasn't about to now. Karen might have thought she'd orchestrated my downfall, but she had no idea that this was the kind of battlefield I thrived in. The neighbors had started to gather at a distance, their porch lights flicking on one by one as they watched from behind fences and windows. I could feel their eyes on me, see the silhouettes pointing and whispering. To them, it must have looked like madness, one man standing against a pack of wild boars. But they didn't know the history, the years of training, the bond one had once formed with animals just like these. I wasn't fighting blind. I was commanding, reclaiming control inch by inch. The noise of the destruction faded into the background as I focused on the rhythm, the signals, the subtle cues that told me the boars were beginning to accept my presence. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the tide had turned. Where Karen had expected chaos, she was about to see something far more dangerous. Order forged in the middle of destruction, led by the very man she had tried to break. When the dust finally began to settle, the scene around me looked like something out of a war zone. The fences were shattered, the crops flattened, and the air was thick with the smell of trampled earth and sweat. The boars, once wild and uncontrollable, now stood in a loose formation around their leader, their heavy breathing the only sound cutting through the night. I kept my stance firm, my whistle at the ready, every muscle in my body tense with the knowledge that one wrong move could send them back into a frenzy. But instead of chaos, there was silence, the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that made every onlooker hold their breath. I could see faces peeking from behind curtains, neighbors standing on porches with wide eyes, phones in their hands, no doubt recording what they thought would be a disaster. To them, Karen had won. She had unleashed 10 monsters onto my land, and they expected to see me destroyed. But what they were witnessing instead was something none of them could have predicted. They saw those boars, massive and dangerous, standing still as if waiting for me to give the next command. They saw control where there should have been mayhem, and in that moment, I knew Karen's plan had backfired. The leader snorted and pawed at the ground, testing me, but I stood my ground without flinching. Slowly, I lowered the feed bag, letting the scent carry through the night. The others shifted, restless but no longer charging blindly. I gave another sharp whistle, and their attention snapped back to me like a line pulled tight. Step by step, I guided them away from the worst of the damage, herding them toward a section of the field that could contain them without causing further destruction. Every move was a battle of will, every signal a reminder that I wasn't a man easily broken. Karen stood at the edge of the street, her arms crossed, her smug smile faltering for the first time since this whole feud began. She had expected to watch me fall apart, to see my farm torn to the ground while the neighborhood laughed behind her backhanded sympathy. But instead, she was watching me take control of the very weapons she had tried to use against me. Her eyes darted from the boars to the neighbors filming, and I could see the panic setting in. This wasn't the spectacle of destruction she'd hoped for. This was a show of strength she couldn't spin in her favor. The longer I held control, the quieter the crowd grew. The whispers faded, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press down on everyone. The boars, still alert and breathing hard, looked less like wild beasts and more like soldiers waiting for orders. And in that stillness I could feel the shift. The neighbors who had once bowed to Karen's authority were seeing her for what she really was. Someone willing to endanger lives and destroy property just to prove she had power. Her plan hadn't just failed. It had exposed her. I didn't speak, didn't need to. The sight of me standing there, commanding order out of chaos, said more than words ever could. The destruction was clear, the battle evident in every broken fence post and trampled row of crops. But so was the outcome. I was still standing, and the boars were no longer her weapon. They were mine. Karen's face tightened, her jaw clenching as the reality of her failure sank in. She had gone too far this time, and the whole neighborhood knew it. The boars shifted again, waiting, and I gave a final sharp whistle, watching as they settled in place. The tension hung heavy in the night air. Every pair of eyes locked on me, waiting to see what would happen next. The silence wasn't just about the animals anymore. It was about the truth that had finally been laid bare. The undeniable proof that Karen's reign of control was crumbling in front of her own eyes. 6.